So I guess it's about time I finished this series. And what's left to say? Zootopia leaves one wanting more, but for all the wrong reasons. Alongside the rush to finish the story is the epilogue to Judy and Nick's experiences. Zootopia ends on a joke, and an obligatory repeat of Try Everything. That feels pretentious, but admittedly that's nothing new. The introductions and finales of various Disney films usually feature a theme built around the message that the story was trying to convey. However, as I went into detail early on in this analysis, the song is very generalized and leaves out a lot of essentials. And I found that is rife throughout the entire film, as I've dug deeper into it. So when Judy grabs the canister of fox repellent from her nightstand, realize that she does this in the face of everything the film built up about her moments previously. From the talent show, to her interactions with her parents, to her standing up for her friends in the face of Gideon Grey. So why does she grab the can of fox repellent? And naturally the best inference is that her bout with Gideon Grey had impacted her judgment. And this is where we see it manifest. But that leads to another issue which is central to why the story overall doesn't work. Specifically, Judy never takes her lapse in judgment as a crisis of character. She doesn't confront her demons. She simply returns to her duty like nothing ever happened. Compiled with that is the fact that the ZPD even allowed her to take questions at the press conference at all, which, as I mentioned before, is bizarre. But that aside, she receives no blame for stirring the pot. In fact, Pogo compliments her, which I've mentioned is a complete 180 from how he was established as well. Overall, Judy isn't made accountable to anyone but herself. And what a comfortable world that must be. She isn't even accountable to Nick, and she only apologizes to him after he refuses to help her. It's all messed up, and I blame the state of the script for most of this. With a couple of tweaks, the movie could be salvaged, maybe. But if Judy was confronted with the same manner of events in the future, what exactly would keep her afloat? Judy would need to look for a reason to return to her central beliefs in the face of such a confrontation. In other words, what source does she confide in about the fidelity of her beliefs? This is a script writing problem, and the script as it is doesn't account for this. Therefore, Judy is constantly rewound to square one of her character conception. My theory in this case is that the writers continually did that without any sense of how a person or a character would grow from their experiences, the experiences they laid out in the script. And this is where you, as a scriptwriter, may need to lean on some real-life experiences and not ideals. Notice how the film had a scene where Clawhauser and Judy firmly established the offensive nature of stereotypes. All well and good, I guess, but afterwards the script seems to forget about this establishment and Clawhauser embraces the stereotype. So what was all that beforehand? It's not a plot hole, it's a minor example that helps to illustrate a problem with how the script overall is continually trying to keep tabs on development. This is also a problem when you establish characters at a peak. You conceptualize them where you want them to be, rather than have the film build them up to that state over time. In which case, the audience will ask, how did they get there? And do you know the answer? In the end, I suspect those writing the story don't even know themselves. And I'll get into that more as I continue here. But my point is that Judy fails to live up to the standards that she tries to extend to everyone else. And that's Zootopia in a nutshell. The writers went in a number of directions and couldn't establish a central narrative. Or rather, they couldn't establish a firm foundation for their narrative. And that is actually what interests me about the film. It's not that Zootopia is a good story, but that it has the workings of a good story. It has potential, and somewhere along the way it settled for less than what it could have been. And by the way, I think that's what drives the fan base. It's not the film itself, but the what-ifs. Now please keep that in mind as I say everything I'm about to say. This is not a black or white issue to me, and that's never how I approach media on my channel. I try to investigate things fairly and accurately, and sometimes that means I need to show how something everyone says was good is actually not so good. And that could be flipped around as well. Aspects thought of as detriments could be compliments. Anyway, I'll do a quick recap of various events of the film. And fair warning, I'm about to become very critical here, so if you're just into believing Zootopia is a flawless piece of art and simply deserves an abundance of praise, then as a fair warning, you might get really upset with all the things I'm about to say.
But sir,
Life isn't some cartoon musical where you sing a little song and your insipid dreams magically come true.
Similar to the sentiments I had expressed concerning Mayor Lionheart, Bellwether's arrest would not have been as easy as it is made out to be. Zootopia promotes a false idea here with concern to how political structures work. The simple question one needs to ask oneself here is, when is the last time you saw a major politician jailed for their crimes? And I'm talking about real life now. To better explain this, Zootopia was released in 2016. That's the same year that Donald Trump won the US presidential election. One may recall that a rallying cry by Trump's supporters was "lock her up," referring to Hillary Clinton and her alleged crimes. Later on, after Trump was elected president, guess what happened? Nothing. During his term, Trump never revisited Clinton's crimes, nor showed any interest in diving into that rabbit hole. But that's how politicians operate, and they've operated like that for a long time now. If you want to go further back into history, recall that Richard Nixon received a pardon from Gerald Ford after Watergate. And there are any number of examples of elected officials simply getting away with everything and anything. The point I'm trying to make here is that jailing a politician is far from being as easy as Zootopia makes it out to be. Hell, some might even say jailing a politician is outright impossible given their wealth and connections. Somewhere along the way, the writers could have acknowledged and written the script according to a narrative about political corruption, and Chief Bogo could have been set up as an antagonist in that regard, the militant arm of the city, providing cover for the affairs of Lionheart and Bellwether.
I'm going to open this door and you're going to tell that otter you're a former meter maid with delusions of grandeur who will not be taking the case.
Instead, Zootopia is built around the belief that the thin blue line will stand faithfully between the citizenry and criminals. And true police are often propped up as modern-day chivalry or superheroes, men and women in uniform, depicted as these lawful good paladins coming to aid us in our time of need. What is not so expressed, however, is the reality. The reality is that one set of rules applies to politicians and their agencies, and the other to the common everyday citizen. And in that reality, the police may not intervene during your moment of crisis, nor are they necessarily required to. Police carry weapons, but they do that to defend themselves, not us. And the idea of police providing you with your own personal protection services is not even a function of law enforcement. One might assume that the police are here to serve and protect. But that's just a motto. Specifically, that's the LAPD's motto, the LAPD about which the ZPD is largely based. But there's no strict adherence to a motto. The reality is police are only beholden to their responsibilities insofar as they serve the interests of the municipal, the county, or state. Period. They remain a civilian force of public servants, paid for by your local, state, and federal tax dollars. And courts have ruled time and time again that their only duty is in the interest of the state. They have zero constitutional duty to protect the common citizen. Now, the overall point I want to make here is not to condemn the police, rather to show how the police could have been illustrated as the militant arm of corrupt politicians, a viable story avenue for Zootopia to have taken. For such an avenue would have the propensity to cause Judy to rethink her ideals and philosophies, to reconsider the entire reason that she wanted to become a cop in the first place. That way you have some learning and growing occur within your main character. My talking about politics isn't beyond the pale when referring to Zootopia, because we have the Mammal Inclusion Initiative, aka affirmative action. As things stand, this is basically a constitutional amendment. And we know this because Bogo and the ZPD are made to abide by its standards, as far as Judy's induction is concerned. The point is that all the interactions that Judy has with Bogo are therefore rendered erroneous. Bogo would never have abided by the whole 3 days thing, and so on and so forth, because he doesn't actually run the ZPD, the mayor does.
Do you think the mayor asked what I wanted when he assigned you to me?
Given all that, any abject treatment of Judy would never have happened, at least not in public. The ZPD would be walking on eggshells as far as any interaction with Judy was concerned, given the recognition that she was basically a political monster. She was there by constitutional mandate, not due organic induction. The problem in question is this: at what point do the characters realize that the people in power are manipulating the moral tenderness of the public for political gain? At what point does Judy come to terms with the fact that she was used by politicians to draw sympathy towards themselves? Shouldn't that constitute a crisis of character for her? In her selection at the academy and then so on through her entire career as a police officer? Now, this is a problem that the film never addresses, which would entail the writers don't see it as a problem. Perhaps they haven't thought of it as deeply as I have. However, one does catch glimpses of how the writers could have addressed it. For instance, Bellwether admits she feels she was only made deputy mayor because Lionheart wanted the sheep vote. And the same goes for the Mammal Inclusion Initiative. the manipulation of local politics to buy votes. The film plays this both ways. The politics that ensured Judy could become a cop were also used to prop up corrupt politicians. I don't think the film's writers completely understood that, but that's why I said the film is about hypocrisy, or at least should have been about that. Initially, the reason Judy was an interesting character was because she was a hypocrite. Sure, hypocrisy is a negative trait, but your character is allowed negative traits insofar as they work to overcome them during the course of the story. I suppose Judy does come to terms with her hypocrisy, but not in a way that is adverse to anything she believed previously. In other words, she has a blind spot that is intrusive to the values she holds. But in no way does the film draw attention to that. She never comes to any ultimate realization about her sanctimony. She just gets this revelation about the Night Howlers and then urges Nick to come help her. And only when she sees Nick is still dejected does she issue an apology. Far better it would have been for Judy to have thoroughly re-examined her feelings first and then come to Nick on behalf of having wronged him and others with her own bigotry. However, beyond her kerfuffle at the press conference, Judy never resolves the fact that she used the political system to get ahead, which, as a reminder, falls in line with Mayor Lionheart and Bellwether. Compare this to what was said about Lionheart engaging in race baiting to win elections. Should any of that have moved Judy to conclude she ought to rethink her methodology? But see, the film never justifies Judy's desire to become a cop outside her merely being an activist, which I will get into in due course. But we never saw her have any meaningful interactions with her fellow cadets at the academy, and even her initial introduction with 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗍, the very first person she meets in the ZPD, was her telling him to be more tolerant. She very openly tries to correct what she perceives as an error in social conduct, and she is still wearing the fox repellent on her belt as she does this, by the way. As a side note, compare this with the fact that Nick knows Judy has the fox repellent on her belt from the moment they meet each other, and yet he says nothing to her, until the press conference, of course. In retrospect, this makes Nick appear far more genuine than Judy, and he's no activist. Instead, Nick is incredibly humble and forgiving. Now true, he believes in many of the same things that Judy does, but he isn't out and about signaling virtue. Moreover, he allows Judy into some of the more tender moments of his life, knowing full well she has a chip on her shoulder. And even after what he experienced as a junior Ranger Scout, what's remarkable about him is that he gives Judy a chance to be his friend. And so it seems somewhere along the way that Judy should have recognized that and acknowledged it, and learned from it. Another irony is that Judy was made frustrated by Nick's use of the law to cover his popsicle hustling, which can be used as yet another analogy for Judy herself having used the political system to become a police officer. You see, everyone is using politics in this film to get ahead, and yet Judy wants to be the sole exception. That is the nature of hypocrisy. Continuing on, Judy doesn't try to become friends with anyone on the police force, let alone interact with very many of them during the entire course of the movie. The closest we get is when she speaks with 𝗘𝘃𝗃𝗍 and Bogo, but there she's more focused on doing her job than she is actually getting to know her coworkers. What does that all entail? Well, this would tell the audience that Judy doesn't really care about the people she works with. And in fact, she does see them more as stepping stones on the road to achieving an ideal. She truly is a political monster. While she's a prey species, in practice, she is a predator. Now, the story could have gone in a far different and, I dare say, more worthwhile route to capitalize upon this flaw in Judy's character. Perhaps she could have continually connived her way to the top through the political system, thereby continually forcing the ZPD into compliance, including Bogo. Now, where that would lead her would be uncovering corruption from the top, but she would also realize that exposing that corruption would come at the cost of her own career, or worse, her own life. And that's where the dominoes would start to fall, that even as much as Judy thought she could use the political system to get ahead, such a Faustian bargain would make her a slave to that system. As I was saying earlier, corruption could have been made even more possible through Chief Bogo, a highly decorated officer colluding with the mayor in order to maintain their dominance of the city. And so if Judy was on some case that threatened to expose the mayor, naturally Chief Bogo would endeavor to cause Judy's investigations to fail. And then of course that would lead him to saying that he would never trust the word of a fox. And there Judy would narrow-mindedly assume it was all about race and bigotry, overlooking the real reason. Now here let me cover something fundamental, namely just how outlandish Judy's character conception is. First of all, her character is almost wholly conceived as a mouthpiece for an ideal. Now that's similar to the conception of Rey from the Star Wars sequels, in that her character enters the story knowing everything she needs to know. Now classically, a main character would enter the story highly ignorant of the world around them, and so their experiences along the way would work to convince them of what is right and wrong. And that's what's generally known as an arc. Judy, on the other hand, enters the story knowing all she needs to know. And let me explain why this is the case more thoroughly. Notice Judy's play, seen at the very beginning of the film, contains no details as to why predator and prey suddenly decided to let bygones be bygones. It just happened. As far as we know, that was all completely arbitrary. Furthermore, the fact that someone like Judy would ascribe herself one way, while someone like Gideon Grey would ascribe himself another, is not at all explained by the context of the film. It paints a world in black and white, leaving little to no room for complexity. Throughout the film, Judy never deviates from her ideals, even when she picks up the fox repellent from her nightstand, or further theorizes that there's a biological component to why the mammals went savage. At no point does she look in the mirror and realize she's telling everyone else to live their lives in ways that she doesn't even live up to herself. The only hiccup to all this is the way the script is written. It forces Judy to say things that really have nothing to do with why she made her statements at the press conference in the first place. She says it's not like a bunny could go savage when that really has nothing to do with anything. She did not allude to the biological component out of spite for her fellow mammal. It came about purely as a result of what the facts were. Moreover, when Judy says to Nick, "You're not like them," that doesn't follow the script at all either. It's just more to induce drama into the current scene. And as a side note, asserting that there's a them is also something Nick did on the gondola ride away from the Rainforest District.
Never let them see that they get to you.
But the writers seem to have forgotten about that as well. The point I want to make here is that the film does not give us a baseline understanding as to where the central conflict occurs, and yet still proceeds under the assumption that the audience is well aware of it. Now that has led me to conclude that the central message is hinged on affirmation bias. To make things clear, affirmation bias is when you engage in media that actively supports what you already believe in, without telling you anything new. In essence, what this means is that the film relies on an active viewpoint already espoused by its audience. Some call this preaching to the choir. Now here one might say that adherence to tolerance or equality is common sense, and the film doesn't need a baseline. To which I say, if it's conventional wisdom, why does the film need to preach anything at all? Something funny to see are all the reviews or merits the film has received complimenting it, as somehow instilling these lessons during its course. To me, that's like watching a sports game with one team entering at 100 points ahead of the opposing team, alongside a crowd of people who think it's a boast when they're rooting for the winning team. In hindsight, the problem with Judy's ideals are not necessarily the ideals themselves, but their root. They have no clear origin. And this is not a conflict about dictionary definitions. Rather, this is a conflict about who makes the definitions in the first place. I can go about preaching tolerance and equality all I want, and so can you, and so can anyone, but that doesn't mean we're necessarily using the terms the same way. This is a twofold problem, in fact, because without a firm foundation as to the origin of tolerance and equality, there also comes a problem in defining the antithesis to these ideals. Therefore, Bellwether's motivations are also confusing. And I'm not saying it's hard to understand why Bellwether would garner a chip on her shoulder based on how Mayor Lionheart treats her. However, what I am saying is having her start a war against predators is just as outlandish as having Judy preach her ideals at a talent show. Because this is a twofold problem, the way to construct one's villain lies within how one constructs one's protagonist. I'll draw a comparison to The Incredibles. One of the more memorable characters in the film is Syndrome, the villain. What's funny about Syndrome is that despite being the antagonist, his sentiments echo those of Dash, one of the story's protagonists.
But Dad always said our powers were nothing to be ashamed of. Our powers made us special.
Everyone's special, Dash.
Which is another way of saying no one is.
And when everyone's super, no one will be.
Now this is essential to establishing an antagonist. One needs a proper antithesis for the main character and what the main character believes. Often this is the central conflict to any drama. The fact that the protag is actually fighting herself and her own ideals, even insofar as she is fighting the antag. What makes Syndrome an effective character is that as much as we disagree with what he does, we can at least understand why he does it. The love and admiration he displayed for Mr. Incredible when he was a child was eventually twisted into envy and hatred when he became an adult. In Zootopia, this could have been achieved through Judy by dropping the activist angle entirely. and simply giving Judy a grudge against predators. However, due to her civil nature, that grudge would manifest itself in her pushing for equality. But her grudge would be thinly veiled, arising from conflicts with predators like Gideon Grey. She would aspire to be a cop because she hates her own weakness, not because she wants to align herself with a political ideal. And that story angle would be a great segue into Judy discovering how to use politics to get ahead, similar to how she gained entrance to the ZPD via the Mammal Inclusion Initiative. She would decide that if she couldn't convince people, she would use the bureaucratic system in her favor to make them do what she wanted. And that would work for her, at first, until she discovers there's corruption at the top. And that's where the character drama would take a turn. Now, there's a lot of details to be filled in here. The story I envision is that Judy would be highly tempted to engage in said corruption, given the power it entails, but ultimately she decides not to. She does the right thing. Through Nick, she would gain insight about how all mammals, predator and prey, were indeed equal, but unfortunately equally oppressed by those at the top. Hence what Mr. Big tells Judy.
My child, we may be evolved, but deep down, we are still animals.
This would lead to an endeavor to topple Zootopia's ivory tower from within, an act which ultimately leads Judy to realize that the police, the press, the mayor, deputy mayor, everyone was crooked. And the ending I envision is bittersweet. Judy ultimately fails to change much in Zootopia before being forced to take an early retirement. A scandal is pinned on her, falsely, where she is shown to be bigoted towards foxes. And Nick would try to stand up for her, of course, but ironically he would be ignored. And after all that, Judy decides to leave Zootopia behind and Nick goes with her. Soon after, they get married and live out their days in Bunnyboro, selling blueberry pies. Instead, how does Zootopia actually end? Well, Judy and Nick are just friends. That's it. There's no hugging, no kissing, the latter of which I am obliged to say did not happen because Disney was uncomfortable with the implications of an interspecies relationship. I suppose one could read more into it, given Judy confirms that she loves Nick, but it's not romantic, it's just platonic. One doesn't at all get the impression romance was ever implied, particularly because Disney purposely deleted scenes that suggested otherwise. And in the end, what did Judy learn? Nothing. Or at least nothing she didn't already know. Vicariously, what did the audience learn? Nothing. Or at least nothing we didn't already believe was true.